This is Angus. Angus has done a lot of awesome stuff. I didn't prepare an introduction, but I work with Angus pretty well. He's written a really cool book on JavaScript that you should check out. And he's going to talk about service workers.
Thank you. Hey there, everyone. So as John Carlos said, I'm going to talk about service workers with the emphasis on service workers for performance and how it can make your website more performant. So what is a service worker? In a nutshell, it's a separate script, runs in its own scope, and runs separate from the main web page, and it intercepts all HTTP requests. So you get a callback every time your HTTP request hits the service worker, and you can do anything you like in the callback. There's some conventional things that people so far do in service workers, which I'm about to show you, but you could really do anything there. So here are like four typical things you would do with a service worker. And this actually, yeah, this is the wrong slide. Sorry. So don't take any notice of where it says pre-cache resource on service worker, but this is just showing where the service worker fits into the architecture. So the request comes from the browser, any request for a resource, whether it be HTML or JavaScript or anything else. Service worker lives on the browser, and it has its own service worker cache. And bear in mind that cache it's a distinct cache. It's not the memory cache or the disk cache or any other cache that we're familiar with. Now this is the right header. So first thing you can do is pre-cache resources on the service worker. So if you whitelist a set of resources when you define your service worker file, such as JavaScript files or anything else, as soon as you load the page, which will load the service worker, it will hit the server, make a request, add the response as the cloned version. There we go. The cloned version of that response to the service worker cache. Secondly, you can fetch first and then give a directive, say, hey, service worker, when you come back with a response, I want you to put the response in the service worker cache. So we see the clone response goes in service worker cache, as well as sending to the browser back to the browser the same thing. We need to clone the response, otherwise you have two versions in play, two references to the same thing, and that could be problematic. Third thing, if you already have the resource in the service worker cache, you don't need to hit the server. You make a request for main.js. Service worker, it says, hey, service worker, have you got main.js? The service worker said, I have main.js. I can give it straight back to you. Don't have to hit the server. And finally, if you're not interested in using the service worker particular response, say for an API request, for example, you can just go straight through, and as though there was no service worker, it'll just do the request response in the conventional way. So those are actually, you come back. So those are the four things you would typically do in a service worker. Like I said, you can do whatever you like, and I think in the future we'll use them for more interesting things still. But that's where it stands. Now, the most famous use of a service worker, if you say service worker to most people, they'll say, "Oh, that's for offline, so I can run my app offline. I've cached the responses previously, therefore, even if my network's down, I can see content still." But what about performance? So actually, what do we care about in web performance? And so we tend to throw around performance as a very generic thing, but it's depending on context and the network and the kind of app we care about different things. But I say primarily we want to get the content back on the page as quick as we possibly can. So we want the time to render, the time to start a render to be as quick as possible. And that's known as DOM content loaded event. And DOM content loaded basically means the HTML has been passed and all blocking assets, JavaScript, CSS, etc., have been fetched. So we want to get that time as short as we possibly can. Well, you might ask, what's wrong with existing caching mechanisms? We have memory cache and disk cache. So why do we need this service worker cache? So memory cache, it's on the browser, or it's on the client machine. Same thing, don't have to hit the server, it gives it straight back to you. The drawback is it only lives as long as the browser session. So if you come back or you open another tab, the memory cache has gone. You've also got disk cache, which also lives on the client machine. Actually, not maybe so well known, but disk cache can be very slow, particularly in lower end devices. And in fact, Alex Russell, who's an evangelist for web performance, said some systems are so degraded that local caches fetched from disk may perform worse than requests for equivalent resources from the network. And that's pretty significant. So he's saying, if your device is not so modern, say it's an old Android or something, you're actually slowing performance down. By hitting the disk cache, it's actually slower than going to the server each time. Now, obviously, that varies a lot depending on what the network speed, server performance, and all that kind of thing. Additionally, we often don't cache. In fact, most of the times, we don't cache HTML files in disk cache or memory cache. And there's a good reason for that, is because we need to know when something's changed. And in modern web apps, HTML has the reference to all the other resources and the hash names of all the other resources that we're going to load. If you do another build, you'll never pick up the new hash names because you just cached the HTML. It's still pointing back to the same thing. But it'd be really good if we could cache the HTML more often, because, as I said, that contains directives for all the other asset fetching. And so if we're talking about performance and it's a slow network or something else is slow, we can't even begin to fetch the rest of the assets until we've loaded the HTML. So there's that critical gap, very, very critical pause. Nothing else can start until you've loaded the HTML. So it's vitally important if performance is of the essence that you get your HTML back as quickly as you can. So yeah, that's basically what I've just said. So you can cache the HTML with service worker. So an initial payload, obviously you don't have it. You do the normal thing. You fetch it from the server. You cache the clone response in the service worker cache. Next time we just pick it up from the service worker cache. At this point, you're probably saying, well, doesn't service worker have the same problems? Doesn't that like cache the HTML and you've no idea when to invalidate the cache and fetch an updated HTML? To a point, that is true, and you can get burned with service worker. I certainly have. I think most people do the first time they use it. But every time you do a page load, it will fetch the service worker file. Whenever there's a byte, even 1 byte changes in the service worker, it will call your activate handler or your install handler in the service worker, which is a function which lets you do anything you want. And you can clear the cache there. So basically, whenever your service worker changes, it probably means you did another app build, but it almost certainly means that, which means you probably should invalidate the HTML cache at that point. In fact, any other caches that you've got new updated versions for. So that gives you a pretty handy way to know when the cache has changed and to only invalidate it when you have to. So what we should be wary of is before we cache HTML, make sure it really is, like you make an HTML request, make sure the response really is HTML before you cache it. Otherwise, you'll keep on serving this non-HTML page to people, and it probably won't have a reference to the service worker either. So you'll be basically stuck at that point, and that's an initial problem, an early problem that happens to a lot of people using service workers. Similarly, make sure the response code is a 200 and not, say, a 301 or 302. So it's the final version of the HTML that you're actually seeing there. And now I'm going to do a demo. Actually, I'm not sure if I can go to Chrome on this machine, so let me see what happens. No idea. Looks like I can. So I'm going to open a new window so just don't mess up anything that's already here. And I'm going to use m.uber.com, which is the mobile web app specifically designed for places where network is slower or people's devices are older. Let's see if that loads. Yeah, it looks like it. I won't do anything. Well, I'm going to say use location services. I probably shouldn't because it's not my machine, but okay. Sorry. Okay. So, yeah, here we go. I'm just going to put the mic down for a second. And one thing you can do, a trick to bypass service worker is there's a bypass for network checkmark. So if you don't want the service worker to be active, you can just click that button. I'm just going to preload the cache by loading the page once. And again, with the service worker on, so it also preloads the service worker. Okay, so now let's make the network speed slow, because really, if you have good device and fast network, you don't care about performance much. You care about it when those things are not so good. So let's make it a slow 3G connection. And now I'm going to clear this network tab, maybe just show JavaScript. Okay, and now load the page and actually turn service worker off. Okay, and now load the page and see how long that takes. So you can see the HTML still loading. HTML took 2.27 seconds, so nothing else could load till then. And the DOM content loaded, we can see at the bottom, is 2.477 seconds. Now, if we turn on the service worker and do the same thing and clear this, well, actually we don't need to, and reload the page, you can see 21 milliseconds of the HTML, it was cached. DOM content loaded is 321 milliseconds. So we saved about 2 seconds on a slow 3G network by using a service worker. Now, let me see if I can get back to the slide deck. You would think I would be able to. Sorry. Okay, it's in another window, that's why. Okay, so back to presentation mode. So there is a plugin, there is a Fusion plugin for Service Worker. It's a work in progress. It's kind of early days. It definitely works. What it won't do is transpile your service worker. So you've got to beware not to put any non-transpilable JavaScript. Now, fortunately, most browsers that support service worker also support most modern JavaScript features. So unless you're using async await, in fact, most of those now support async await. But you should just be careful. But we very shortly will be launching an upgrade to the Service Worker plugin where you'll be able to transpile it, and it has an out-of-the-box basic Service Worker, which when you do a Webpack build, pushes those bundles to the service worker so it knows what it has to cache. You can also customize your service worker too. And that's all I have. Okay, thank you.